This story is about an ordinary boy named Kim Jeong-do. He lived a typical gloomy life. He went to school. No one noticed him there. Even his parents didn't care. Even the teachers didn't call his name on the attendance list. Then everything changed in one day, and a true apocalypse began. That's when Jeong-do realized the advantage of being unnoticed, even by monsters. It all started with a dead fish, the first sign of the apocalypse. Research revealed that the cause was a virus, just like in a typical horror movie, right? Due to bad weather conditions, glacier melting, a deadly pathogen, and blah blah blah, everything as usual. Jeong-do was getting ready for school as always, feeding his pets. Then he put on his shoes and said goodbye to his mom. But she didn't react, just a typical loser. At school, once again, no one noticed him, not even the teachers. On his way home, he thought, as always, about why he even bothered going to that school. Suddenly, someone called out to him. Finally, something interesting was happening. A classmate yelled at him, saying he was supposed to help her clean up. Jeong-do was shocked that someone spoke to him, but he said he wasn't on duty at all. The classmate pointed out that it was even written on the board that Jae-hyun Choi was on duty. At that moment, Jeong-do realized he had been mistaken for someone else again. So he simply turned around and continued home. Gloomy Jeong-do, in a bad mood, walked while listening to music. He did this so that no one would distract him. After all, no one talks to people with headphones on. Suddenly, someone ran past him, screaming. Jeong-do turned back, curious for some reason. But when he looked back, he couldn't believe it wasn't a prank. For there stood some kind of monster. But it was too early for Halloween. Out of fear, Jeong-do's headphones fell out of his ears. He fell to the ground, but the monster simply walked past. Even it wasn't interested in him. Could anything be more insulting? At that moment, an emergency was announced on the radio across the country. And nearby, that monster began devouring an ordinary passerby. Someone fell out of a window. A true apocalypse had begun. Oh yes, finally something interesting was happening. But there were actually some perks to being unnoticed. After all, no one notices you without exception. Sometimes it feels good to be invisible. The wandering monsters on the streets constantly reminded of the apocalypse, but humanity had not yet met its end. After all, in the end, Jeong-do was still alive. Why he survived didn't interest him, though the answer was quite obvious. It all looked like ordinary life in the city. People were going about their business, but the problem was that these were not people. Well, almost all of them. Morning came, and someone entered the cafe. Everything there looked like it had been through an apocalypse. Furniture was scattered, dirt and blood everywhere. But it wasn't a monster that entered. It was that girl from school who had mistaken Jeong-do. She saw that there was a monster lying on the table. She poked its head with a bat. Zero reaction, after which she paused for a second. Then she decided she needed to find something to eat. But then something came over her. She suddenly swung and was about to hit the monster. Just then, something stopped her at the last second. That sound. She completely didn't notice Jeong-do, who was sitting nearby and eating something. Jeong-do was once again unnoticed, as was customary. She wanted to cautiously approach closer, but the drink bottle had other plans. Jeong-do heard the sound and turned sharply. He was eating, his mouth full of food. He didn't know what to say. A monster rose up behind him. Suddenly, all the monsters began to crawl out. They appeared as if from nowhere. Events shifted to the past, where she had trained until losing consciousness. She had run quite a bit in a short time. But the coach was never satisfied. Out of anger, he even threw the stopwatch, after which he started yelling that she could do better and was completely slacking off. Then he ordered her to run again and blew the whistle. Suddenly the doors swung open, and that same girl was already running from the monsters. The hard training and strict teacher had paid off. Perhaps that's why she survived. Jeong-do ran after her. He lost his breakfast, which had already been infested with parasites. But he didn't manage to run far. He fell face down because he tripped over a monster lying in the doorway. Jeong-do lay there for a while. Suddenly, someone approached him and started laughing. It was a little boy. He joked about whether Jeong-do was going to sleep there. The teenager got up and immediately left, but the boy chased after him. Jeong-do called him Samshik and asked if he had seen where that person had just run off to. Samshik said that Jeong-do must have hit his head as all the people had turned into monsters. Jeong-do got angry and told him to go away if he was going to talk nonsense. And the teenager ran off quickly. Jeong-do ran through the streets. He looked around to find her. And suddenly, he heard some screams. It was her fighting. One monster was very actively trying to eat her. The girl was cornered and screamed for the monster to leave her alone. Just then, someone grabbed the zombie and pulled it away. She couldn't believe her eyes. But there was no time to be surprised. so she quickly closed those doors. When silence fell, she could finally think about what had happened, but there were no explanations. Suddenly, she sharply and unexpectedly fell to the ground, landing painfully on her backside. It was Jeong-do who had opened the door and accidentally pushed her. He didn't notice her and closed the door. He wanted to open another door, but the handle was locked, so he knocked on it and asked if she was okay. Suddenly, a knife was pressed to his face. Such was the gratitude for saving her. She was angry and aggressive. Suddenly, Jeong-do remembered her. He was at a loss for words when he realized she had survived. Jeong-do shouted for her to pull herself together as he knew her name. He called her Ju-myung, and that truly made her stop. She asked how Jeong-do knew her name. The teenager asked her to calm down as he had just saved her after all. Jeong-do said she probably didn't remember him since she didn't even know his name, but they were in the same class. Ju-myung couldn't believe it, as she swore she was seeing Jeong-do for the first time right now, and in the midst of monsters, no less. He replied that he would understand if she mistook him for one of the zombies. Both teenagers admitted they hadn't seen anyone alive in a long time. Ju-myung calmed down and thanked Jeong-do for saving her. Then she asked why he was still there. After all, it was clearly not to save her. Jeong-do confessed that he was looking for his mom. He couldn't find her on his own. That's why he was asking for help. Suddenly, Samshik appeared from the window and told Jeong-do that he was a fool. After all, they had all become monsters. The teenager asked why he had been chasing him. Ju-myung was in shock, sweat dripping down her face, unable to believe what she had seen. Jeong-do was talking to a monster and trying to shove it out the window. Even the last name was in the monster. Ju-myung asked him why he was talking to that monster at all. Just then, Samshik slipped from Jeong-do's grasp and lunged at Ju-myung. The girl instinctively pulled out a knife. She was ready to stab it into Samshik. But suddenly, Jeong-do grabbed the little brat by the cloak and threw him back onto the floor, saving Ju-myung's life once again. He told her he had Samshik under control, so everything was fine. Ju-myung asked what was normal about any of this. Just then, monsters burst into the room. There were a huge number of them, all crashing toward the people. Ju-myung's eyes widened sharply, and she realized it was time to get out of this madness. She quickly ran down the street, but the monsters were catching up to her. Why then were they not bothering Jeong-do? Suddenly, one of the monsters lunged at Ju-myung, but she managed to dodge and ran sharply in the opposite direction. This gave her a head start to escape. She landed in another courtyard, a much quieter one. When she saw that no one was chasing her anymore, she could relax and calmly enter the house. She opened the door and collapsed right in the hallway, completely exhausted, having endured such stress, and so many questions remained unanswered. Suddenly someone spoke to her. Ju-myung was frightened again. It was an ordinary man, surprised that the door was open. A chill ran through Ju-myung when she saw this stranger. For some reason, he seemed eerie. She saw that the man was holding a hammer, and on the ground sat a half-naked girl with her hands tied. Something red was dripping from the hammer and the man's hands. He began to approach her, leaving bloody trails behind him. Ju-myung started to panic, yanking at the door. But now it wouldn't open. The girl's heart was racing. She hadn't felt such fear in a long time. The man was slowly making his way toward her. He showed no emotions at all. Ju-myung pleaded for the door to open. Suddenly, someone just switched the lock. It was that man. He calmly asked if Ju-myung had come to the wrong place. At that moment, the girl felt as if her heart might leap out of her chest. He continued to speak calmly, saying that there were always problems with these doors, especially with this one. There was a pause. The man looked at Ju-myung. He saw the knife, so he understood she was ready to attack. Therefore, he turned and left, saying there had been too many problems lately and he didn't want to scare her. Then he added that if she got in his way, he wouldn't apologize, so he asked her to leave peacefully. Ju-myung slammed the door. This time, it finally opened. Suddenly, the man stopped. A smile appeared on his face, and he added that Ju-myung should go, but he wasn't sure she would be able to escape from there at all. The girl opened the door, and in front of her was a horde of monsters. How had they managed to appear here? Fear was on her face, but there was no choice. Better to flee from here. Monsters were better than people. Suddenly, a hammer hovered above her head, seemingly about to strike her. Meanwhile, Jeong-do was walking and ordered Samshik to stop following him. Samshik agreed but continued to walk. Jeong-do said once more not to follow him. Samshik agreed but kept going. Then Jeong-do couldn't take it anymore, turned around and shouted at the boy to stop moving and stand still. He was frustrated that Samshik had ruined his only chance to find his mom. Suddenly, after those words, the boy just burst out laughing loudly. He told Jeong-do how funny he was. After all, in this chaos on the street, there were only monsters, and it was foolish to think that a person could be found here. Having been unnoticed for many years, Jeong-do understood that hiding in a crowd was not difficult. He often forgot that they were monsters. Perhaps he had also become a monster? Jeong-do said they needed to check and pulled a helmet over Samshik's head. He said the helmet fit perfectly on his big head. Samshik said he even liked it. Then he added that he had been smelling that scent for a long time. Jeong-do asked what scent Samshik was talking about. He couldn't smell it through the helmet. Suddenly, the boy said he could smell the girl they had seen. Then a smile appeared on Jeong-do's face. He was happy and wanted to quickly find out where the scent was coming from. Meanwhile, events shifted back to that strange house. Joo-myung jolted awake. She was in some room on a bed. There was a rope on her arm. It seemed she had been tied up, and her head hurt a lot. It felt like it was on fire. She saw blood on her fingers. There was a wound on her head. Suddenly, Joo-myung heard someone's voice shouting and apologizing. There was a quarrel. Someone was trying to escape while he was away. Joo-myung cautiously peeked out from behind the door to see what was happening. That man was holding his victim by the face. She was trembling with fear and he was filled with rage, after which he kicked her away roughly. The woman was saying she wanted to live. The man replied that then she shouldn't have killed his wife, as she also didn't want to die. Her hands were tied very tightly. She said she couldn't do anything then, and begged to be let go. She was ready to do anything. Tears streamed down her face, and she pleaded to be released for any favor. Then the man said he wanted his wife's stewed kimchi, or better yet, her noodle soup or pickled radish. The poor woman said she would do anything he asked if there were ingredients. Suddenly, a hammer hovered in the air. The man asked how she didn't understand that it was impossible. He added that they would discuss it when she woke up. Suddenly, the hammer fell right in front of the woman, and behind the hammer, the man fell too. Joo-myung hit him with a vase and knocked him out immediately. Meanwhile, Jeong-do was carrying Samshik in his arms, who was having a great time. Suddenly, the boy said he could smell that scent again. But Jeong-do didn't react. He just ran faster. Samshik noticed something strange and asked why Jeong-do had suddenly gone silent, after which he began to kick and flail his arms wildly. This caused Jeong-do to trip over some trash, and he fell loudly again. Meanwhile, Samshik quickly moved ahead. In the meantime, Joo-myung was untying the poor girl and trying to understand what was happening at all. The woman said he was sick and explained that when Joo-myung was hit on the head, the madman felt sorry for her, that he had carried her to the bedroom. He was just insane. Joo-myung brought clothes for the girl. She told her to get dressed so they could carry the body out. Suddenly, she noticed something. That man, he had woken up and started talking. He said he was sorry and apologized. His victim began to tremble all over. He had scared her so much that she couldn't move at the sound of his voice. The man began to rise and asked why they had said he was dead, after which the mood suddenly changed, and he started screaming that she had no conscience at all, and it didn't matter to her that she had killed his wife. Suddenly, the madman just vomited on the floor. The girl's hair stood on end. From what they saw, the man extended his trembling hand and asked if they knew what it was like to lose a beloved wife. His face began to distort, his teeth yellowed, and his mouth filled with saliva. He began to transform into a monster. Events shifted back to the past. There she stood by the window and covered her mouth with her hands. Then she grabbed a knife. The madman with the hammer was knocking on the door, asking her to open it as he had just seen her. The girl was crying hard and didn't know what to do. Then she was told to wait as something was happening, and they would return soon. Monsters were following them. They were in serious danger. The girl heard many screams and knocks at the door. When they stopped, there were already human screams and cries. The girl stood up and approached the window. There was a lot of blood and monster corpses on the floor, and the man held his wife. She watched all of this from the window. She felt very sorry then, but first and foremost, she thought about herself and her safety, and she had the right to do so. Events returned to reality, where for some reason she had to pay for her desire to be safe. The man, who was turning into a monster, wanted to eat his victim and promised to show her what it was like to lose a loved one. But before he could attack the girl, who could barely move from fear, that pot flew into his head again. This time, Joo-myung struck harder. But even that didn't help. The man was still alive. Something had to be thought of quickly. The crazed monster was approaching them. Time was running out, but Joo-myung had a knife. Suddenly, someone shoved her forward from behind. Ju-myung didn't even notice the betrayal that had just been inflicted on her. Before she knew it, she was in the monster's embrace. The man reached his victim, and she fell out of the window, that ungrateful chicken. Alongside her, Ju-myung's knife also fell. Meanwhile, the man opened the closet that led down, and he shouted that the scum had escaped, so he would cut off her legs when he found her. Then he began to drag Ju-myung's body, after which he threw her hard like some kind of trash. She hit some iron bars. How could they be in an ordinary house? After that, the man took the knife. Ju-myung came to her senses in the meantime. He said he had been looking for that filth for so long and she had ruined everything for him. The man said he should have killed Ju-myung first. Suddenly hands appeared behind the girl. The man said he had never seen his wife so happy. He asked his beloved to eat more slowly, or else it would be hard to clean up after her, too much mess. And he added that he would make sure she ate well. Suddenly the man just fell. He crashed loudly to the ground. A bucket and a hammer stood nearby. Ju-myung managed to escape from the strong embrace of the monster wife. Suddenly the man got up again, but now he was completely different, because he had also turned into a monster. Ju-myung's eyes widened sharply. She didn't know what to do. Her heart raced. She didn't want to die. She began to quickly feel for the knife on the ground, but her hand was grabbed by the wife. And at that moment, Ju-myung realized that this was the end. She was powerless. Blood splattered across the room, but it was the man's blood, for he had been struck by Jeong-do with an axe. Ju-myung immediately began to free herself from the monster's claws. While Jeong-do looked on in shock at what he had done, Ju-myung finally pulled her hand free, after which she grabbed the knife. She took one last look at that filth. Now she was in control of the rules of the game. Some time passed. The whole room was covered in blood. Jo-myung asked how Jeong-do had found her, but she didn't like the answer that some crazed monster knew her scent. But Jeong-do justified himself, saying he had just learned that Samshik was so sensitive to her scent. Ju-myung asked if he thought she would thank the monster, and in general, who did Jeong-do think he was? She said he was closer to monsters than to humans. Then Ju-myung asked how he planned to deal with this monster. Jeong-do swore that he had kept Samshik under control, but his control ended up with them in the room. Suddenly, Samshik lunged at Ju-myung from behind. Samshik grabbed the girl and began to choke her. Jeong-do grabbed the monster by the cloak and quickly tore it away from Ju-myung's neck. Then he threw it to the ground. Ju-myung took the knife and went for Samshik. She asked Jeong-do if he would be upset if she killed this monster, but the teenager asked her to stop. Suddenly, a huge face appeared in the window. Jeong-do was in a stupor and didn't understand what was happening. A massive hand broke through the window and burst into the room, after which it grabbed Samshik. Everything happened very quickly. Jeong-do shielded Ju-myung, but Samshik was hurt. Ju-myung was shocked. Her heart was racing wildly. Then the monster's mouth appeared, huge, filling the entire window. Had it eaten Samshik? The monster was as tall as the whole house. How could such a creature even exist? It seemed to have gone away. Jeong-do remained unharmed, and Ju-myung was not visible beneath him. As always, the monster was not interested in the teenager. Meanwhile, some time passed. Ju-myung had a terrible headache. It felt like she was losing her mind. Jeong-do looked out the window in search of the monster. At least some. But all that remained of Samshik were bloody traces. Jeong-do turned back to Ju-myung and asked if she knew of any safe places. Jeong-do dragged a wardrobe to the door. Jo-myung protested that it made no sense because the monster was just gigantic. Jeong-do said there weren't many houses as sturdy as this one, and there was a basement here, so it wasn't the worst option. The teenager suggested checking everything once more. Maybe there was still somewhere that wasn't locked. But Ju-myung had already turned around and gone somewhere. She pulled out some canned food from somewhere and began to eat. She ate so greedily that she even took off her sleeves. Suddenly, something stopped her. Jeong-do told her not to pay attention to him and to continue. He would sit for a while. But Ju-myung replied that she had had enough. She remembered that Jeong-do was looking for his mom, but she had never met her. The teenager admitted that he hadn't seen a single person the entire time, until he met her, so he thought Ju-myung might know a place where there were survivors. She said she had heard that people used schools for temporary shelter, but that was a long time ago, and she wasn't sure if anyone was still there. Suddenly, she remembered seeing a couple near the school where she had studied. Jeong-do corrected her that they had studied there together. Ju-myung didn't believe they had actually studied together, but there was only one school in the city. Then she remembered something else. She said a lot had happened and she had completely forgotten to say thank you. But while she was finishing her sentence, Jeong-do had already disappeared. She hadn't even noticed it. The teenager was already on his way to the school. He was surprised he hadn't thought of it earlier, probably because he hated that place. Suddenly, someone called out to Jeong-do. It was Sam-shik. He said he had been calling Jeong-do for a long time and had been very bored alone. Jeong-do was shocked. He suspected that monsters weren't easy to kill, but he hadn't thought it was this bad. He asked if Sam-shik could no longer walk, but the answer was obvious. The boy asked where Jeong-do was going and asked to go along. Jeong-do walked familiar paths. God, how he hated them. Sam-shik spoke from the backpack. He asked where they were going. Then he asked what a school was. Jeong-do was shocked that this little boy didn't even know what that was. There were many monsters near the school, overall, just like everywhere else. Suddenly, Jeong-do heard a sound, as if something had passed by. He asked Sam-shik, but the boy heard nothing. Suddenly, the expression on the teenager's face changed sharply. He saw that huge monster behind him, how big it was. Up close, it was even scarier. Ju-myung opened her eyes. She hadn't even noticed when she fell asleep. At that moment, Jeong-do returned. She asked why he was back so soon. Then she asked why Jeong-do was without shoes. For some reason, he remained silent. So Ju-myung irritably turned back and asked what had happened. Suddenly, she completely stopped breathing from shock and fear. Even her body lost control and she simply fell onto the couch, after which she slid down to the floor. Suddenly, Jeong-do lunged at her, but now he was a monster. The teenager immediately bit her shoulder. She didn't even have time to react. Ju-myung tried to feel for the knife on the couch, and she plunged it sharply into Jeong-do's body. Her hand was already bitten. The process had begun. Suddenly, Ju-myung began to feel excruciating pain throughout her body. She was transforming into a monster. This is how her life and humanity as a whole would end. Just then, Ju-myung jolted awake and sprang out of bed. It had all been just a dream. She went to the bathroom to check her eyes. Ju-myung thought about Jeong-do. He was very suspicious, but he didn't seem that bad having saved her so many times. Yet she didn't even know his name. It was uncertain if they would ever meet again. Suddenly, Ju-myung heard those strange sounds again. She grabbed the knife she always carried with her. Meanwhile, outside the school, a gigantic monster was roaming. Its enormous hand grabbed another monster that was passing by, after which the giant simply devoured the poor creature. Can this be called cannibalism? A terrified Jeong-do watched all of this unfold. His hand trembled. He was in shock and had no idea how to act. The monster was eating its own kind. Suddenly, the creature began to approach Jeong-do. The teenager stood frozen, merely observing. Did the monster notice him? The monster drew closer. Jeong-do couldn't move at all. His body had betrayed him. The monster stepped onto a car, as if simply sidestepping a pebble. Out of fear, Jeong-do shut his eyes, and when he opened them again, the monster was gone. It had simply walked away, bypassing Jeong-do. It hadn't noticed him, as always. Meanwhile, Ju-myung was climbing the stairs and fuming about how anyone could think this place was safe. She stood on the landing, feeling as if the sound was coming from the door. Ju-myung approached cautiously, trying not to reveal herself. Suddenly, the door opened by itself. Ju-myung prepared for an attack, but then she stopped, as there was a child standing before her. They exchanged glances. Ju-myung asked the boy who he was, but the stranger simply turned and walked away. Ju-myung ran after him, trying to find out where he was going, but the boy ignored her completely. Ju-myung noticed that the stranger was searching for something. Then she decided to write down 2 questions on a piece of paper. What was the boy's name and what was he doing? She showed it to the boy, as he surely could read, but this also yielded no results. Ju-myung expressed her frustration that he remained silent. Suddenly, the boy noticed an exit. He headed toward it, but Ju-myung stopped him. She asked if the boy was hungry. Ju-myung tried to gesture to explain what she wanted from him, and the boy nodded. After a while, he was sitting at the table. Ju-myung searched the cupboards for anything edible. It seemed she would have to go hunting for food, because there was absolutely no food at all. Meanwhile, Sam-shik finally spoke up, having been silent out of fear. He waited until the monster left. Suddenly, Jeong-do noticed a car near the school. The teenager felt a very familiar sensation. Jeong-do decided to check the vehicle. Suddenly, he found a phone inside. It contained documents, an ID card belonging to a South Korean citizen, Song-mi Ryeon. Jeong-do felt disheartened as his mother had been here. Sam-shik suddenly asked if the teenager also smelled people. Jeong-do went inside. The teenager said it was very quiet. Not even a mouse could be heard. He doubted that there had really been people here. Samshik was outraged that Jeong-do didn't believe him, but this place truly didn't look like a shelter. Then he decided to go upstairs, but there was nothing there either, only signs of a struggle. A man was sitting in a chair, bound, blood dripping from his mouth, and it was unclear if it was his. The man asked for something sharper than scissors, but there was nothing useful. But the woman told him to make less noise and get more done before Mr. Janami returned. Jeong-do was eavesdropping on this. On the floor nearby, the teenager noticed something strange. Human bones in a bucket. At that moment, the people were talking about wanting to eat young flesh, as this one was too old. Jeong-do covered his mouth with his hand in fear and horror. It seemed those two cannibals heard it. The woman said they could be zombies and asked to sort it out before they came for them. The boy said she had completely lost her mind, as she also had hands and feet. To which he was told that all complaints were directed at Mr. Ginami, or she could tell him herself. He got angry but still left. Along the way, he grumbled that he didn't even know who this Ginami was. The man stepped over the threshold. He surveyed everything around, but there was nothing, just a stain from nausea. The man asked if the monsters were nauseous, as he didn't remember seeing anything like that. The woman replied that the monsters had only been vomiting, and she asked how the boy had survived so long and added that he was really annoying her. He said there didn't seem to be any zombies there. Then the woman told him to get to work immediately before that old man woke up. The boy agreed and was about to go back in, but still felt that something was off. Suddenly, Jeong-do lunged at him. At that moment, the woman turned away and saw nothing. So she decided to go check what had happened. She grabbed a shovel that was by the exit. When she stepped outside, she couldn't believe her eyes. That boy was lying on the floor in a pool of blood. At that moment, she was also attacked. She looked utterly foolish and defenseless, but she struck Jeong-do with the shovel, and it was so hard as if a huge man had hit him. The teenager fell to the ground and trembled all over. The woman said she had just wanted someone younger, and here he was. He crawled toward her. She approached Jeong-do and sniffed him, saying something was off. He didn't smell human at all, but he didn't resemble a zombie either. Jeong-do cried and said it was disgusting. He asked in a trembling voice what they had done to deserve this. The woman laughed and said Jeong-do was too young to understand. In the midst of all this chaos, adults had to choose whether to be human or a monster every damn second. She said they weren't cannibals. She asked not to misunderstand, as it was the only way to find out if Jeong-do was a human or a monster. Saliva dripped from her mouth. It was so gross. After which she suddenly swung. Jeong-do cried and said goodbye to his life. The worst thing in an apocalypse is to die at the hands of a human, not a monster. After which the entire room was splattered with blood. The woman discarded the shovel. She wouldn't need it anymore. Suddenly that disgusting lady noticed something. Something in his backpack was moving vigorously. She thought it was a cat. And such people didn't care what to eat. So she opened the backpack. Samshik lunged at her, and the woman screamed as she exited the room. She tripped over her food partner and fell. Meanwhile, Jeong-do regained consciousness from the loud screams. He had lost quite a bit of blood and felt intense pain, but he still had the strength to get up, and he had no choice. He stepped into the hallway and saw two bodies there. The mangled face of the disgusting woman. She deserved such a death. Nearby was Samshik. He laughed and said he hadn't eaten in a long time. He spoke to Jeong-do with a smile, saying that no matter how much he ate, he could never feel full. Sometimes Samshik frightened him. Meanwhile, the man who had been targeted for eating regained consciousness. He was amazed at how Jeong-do had survived, even after losing so much blood, and he didn't remember him from before. The teenager wanted to free the poor man, but the man told him it was probably a bad idea. It seemed to him that he had been infected for a long time. Those cursed cannibals, he couldn't even find out if he was infected. Then he said that Jeong-do looked very sad. For some reason, the man began to cry and said that the teenager had to meet someone. Before he could finish his thought, he suddenly fell silent, and it seemed like it was for good. Jeong-do noticed the clothes. There were so many of them, it broke his heart. The teenager began to sift through them, but fortunately his mother's were not among them. But then where could she be, and where had she gone? Suddenly Jeong-do spotted a radio among the belongings. He couldn't tell if it was disconnected. He thought he heard someone speaking. Jeong-do decided to escape from this horror. Samshik asked where they were going. The teenager replied that he needed to rest a bit because he was very tired. Suddenly Samshik said he could smell people again. Jeong-do turned around and couldn't believe his eyes. For there sat a girl on the bus, trembling and pleading for help. It seemed she was the one who had pushed Ju Myung. Meanwhile, that cannibal had woken up. His body was shaking as he tried to get up, and his head was spinning. Because of this, he completely failed to see the monster in front of him. Suddenly, at that moment, someone walked in. The cannibal recognized Jin Hee-nam. He asked to remove this filth from him. The boy also recognized his aunt, Moon Bok, after which he cautiously approached and said that he had spared his life so he could help his aunt. He sat down beside them and remarked on what a rude and useless guy he was. The cannibal was terrified, stuttering as he begged him to stop joking and just kill this filth already. Hee-nam was even shocked. Then he said briefly and without emotion that he didn't want to. He wanted to see how this cannibal would die. Hee-nam sat by the wall and apologized for being late. For when everyone turned away, she was the only one who supported. Although, to be honest, she wasn't such a good person, but she was smarter and stronger than the others. But she didn't deserve such a death at the hands of an idiot who didn't even understand what was happening. Hee-nam promised to take revenge on that scoundrel, because his aunt would have done the same. He asked her who that person was. Ju Myung was sitting on the bed, trying to figure out the radio, which seemed to be broken, so she abandoned that idea. And she left the room. Again, Ju Myung was surprised where he had gone. In the hall, she saw that little boy. He was looking out the window at the monster, and it seemed he wasn't scared at all. Then Ju Myung closed the curtains, away from that horror. Afterwards, she laid the boy on the bed and asked if he was all right. Did he really want to die? But she realized that the boy was not scared at all, so there was no point in scolding him. This house was heavy and sturdy, but it had too many windows. She decided to call the boy Nuna, as older girls addressed younger boys. She asked him to stay in the room while she figured something out. Ju Myung went downstairs to the basement. So much had happened in these 2 days that she completely forgot to dispose of the bodies. But she decided to check the room that was there first. She was shocked to see so many building materials. Although it wasn't surprising, in such a house it often came in handy. So Ju Myung took a hammer and boards. Ju Myung stood on a chair, and she began to cover the windows with boards. Now it was better and safer. Finally, Ju Myung finished. There were so many windows in the house. Meanwhile, Nuna had fallen asleep while she was doing repairs here. Ju Myung decided to move him to the bed. He evoked such sweet emotions in her, for the little one was sleeping so sweetly, as if he understood nothing at all. Suddenly, Ju Myung heard some sounds outside. Then familiar voices followed. It was her, the traitor. Jeong-do had met her on the bus, but he had no idea how to talk to her, for the poor girl was trembling and scared. There was a monster by the entrance, and Jeong-do understood that the stranger wouldn't be able to get past it, so he did what he had to do, and he was the first to step inside. Jeong-do said that this was the most common place for monsters, especially at night, so he suggested she go with him. He knew the place better. The stranger trembled at the entrance and was very afraid to go in. She said this wasn't the only house, and they could look for other places. Suddenly, the door opened by itself at that moment. Ju Myung slammed the traitor against the wall even as she tried to justify herself, just like before with that madman. Ju Myung was already doubting her truth. Perhaps she deserved that torture, for such rats had no place in society. The traitor wanted to justify herself, but Ju Myung was fed up and simply threw her to the floor. She said she doubted the stranger could kill a person, but it seemed she was mistaken. Ju Myung was furious and asked what the traitor would say now, that she had also lost her mind. Suddenly, Sam-shik spoke up. He said it smelled very good here and there was so much of everything. Jeong-do asked him to be quieter. Suddenly, the bedroom door opened. Nuna came out. The stranger recognized him, and the boy recognized her too. She cried and said she was very glad he had survived. Then she hugged him tightly and said she was very sorry. They stood like that for a while the traitor cried and apologized. Then Ju Myung asked Jeong-do what had happened to him. Just then, someone spoke over the radio and asked if anyone could hear. The scene shifted back to the past at the playground. It was the best time of life, childhood, but it seemed not for everyone. Jeong-do was unnoticed even here. Children ran and played, but he always stood aside. Suddenly, Jeong-do decided to change that, and he climbed up the slide. The children noticed this. Jeong-do didn't just climb the slide. He stood taller than everyone. Now he was finally noticed. When suddenly the poor boy slipped and fell to the ground. Suddenly someone asked Jeong-do why he was lying there. He woke up. Someone was calling him to catch flies. But Jeong-do didn't understand who was calling him. He couldn't move. His hands were tied. Was it a strange dream or perhaps a memory? Jeong-do sat bound against the wall. In that prison with the bodies, something was wrong. Jeong-do tried to escape and understand what had happened. Perhaps he had done something wrong. But the truth was, he didn't understand anything. And he was tied up so tightly. The last thing he remembered was Ju Myung lunging at that girl. But then he remembered nothing. Suddenly the door opened. Someone walked in. With an axe, Jeong-do. It was Ju Myung. Jeong-do immediately bombarded her with questions about what had happened. He said he had woken up tied up. Jeong-do thought Ju Myung had come to rescue him. But she said she also didn't understand what was happening and really wanted to find out. Ju Myung asked why Jeong-do had her father's radio. She threatened to smash his head if he didn't give a good reason. Jeong-do said he didn't know it was her father's radio, and then he added that it probably looked like he had stolen his radio and killed him. Jeong-do asked if it was true that Ju Myung had thought of something so insane. But he had never killed anyone. Ju Myung said she asked because she didn't understand anything herself. After all, he knew so much about her and even had her father's radio. Jeong-do explained that it seemed to him that someone was talking about her, which is why he took it. He added that he found the radio at school and thought it would help him find his mom. Ju Myung inquired where exactly Jeong-do had found this radio and why his father was even at school. Jeong-do suggested going there, although it was much more dangerous than he had thought. He said that Ju Myung shouldn't go there alone, and he clearly remembered which classroom he found the radio in. Ju Myung proposed they go together if Jeong-do didn't mind. So the teenagers left the house. Jeong-do asked if it was okay to leave a child alone, to which Ju Myung replied that she hadn't planned on becoming a mom. The two of them stayed home in the meantime and slept peacefully. Meanwhile, the teenagers had already reached the school. Jeong-do checked everything and said it was all clear. So they headed to the schoolyard. The sun was setting. It was dangerous. Nam was wandering around that floor. Suddenly he realized something. How was he supposed to take revenge if he hadn't even seen who killed her? This frustrated him greatly. Even if he found the person, how would he know it was the right one? There weren't even any clues. And Nam didn't want to kill innocent people. He sat in the classroom and just thought. Nam decided he wasn't particularly upset. After all, he had already avenged many. Just then he heard some noise. Nam jumped up suddenly. Meanwhile, the teenagers had already made it to the same floor, but there were no bodies or monsters. Ju Myung immediately sensed a terrible and sharp smell everywhere. Then she saw a bucket filled with human bones. Even for her, this was too much. They cautiously stepped into the classroom. They froze at the entrance to take everything in. Suddenly, Jeong-do noticed something. That old man. He had indeed become a monster. His spot was empty. Jeong-do pointed out the place where he found the radio and indicated that pile of things. Ju Myung didn't know what her dad had been wearing. Suddenly, Jeong-do remembered something. How the monster had cried and asked if the teenager had also lost someone close. Then Jeong-do asked Ju Myung what her father looked like. A pause fell between them, as if puzzle pieces were fitting together. Ju Myung asked if he had seen her dad. But Jeong-do wasn't sure. He had just seen someone, and he said that the old man had been tied to a chair. Ju Myung was worried about why he had been tied up. Jeong-do explained that some crazies had tortured the man to death, but he had stopped them in time. He even wanted to save that man, but it didn't work out. Ju Myung was angry that Jeong-do suddenly fell silent. She wanted to know what happened next. It turned out that Nam had been eavesdropping on their conversation. A smile appeared on his face because now he understood who the killer was. He decided to announce himself immediately. He entered the room and politely greeted everyone. He asked if they were peers. Nam ignored the teenager's questions and said he truly didn't understand. How could this happen? He didn't believe that his aunt Moonbok had died because of Jeong-do. After all, he looked like he wouldn't hurt a fly. Nam drew his sword. Silence fell after that. Ju Myung asked Jeong-do what was happening and if he knew him, but the teenager had never seen him before at all. Jeong-do said he didn't know anything about any aunt. Nam said with a smile that he thought about killing them both so that Jeong-do wouldn't be so lonely on his way to his aunt.